London, 1970. In the northern part of the city, tucked behind rusted iron gates and overgrown with decades of wild ivy, sits one of the most atmospheric cemeteries in the world, Highgate Cemetery. A Victorian masterpiece of Gothic architecture, crumbling mausoleums and winding stone pathways that disappear into the dark. People have been buried here since 1839. Thousands of them, stacked in layers beneath the earth, sealed in vaults, entombed in elaborate stone chambers built for the wealthy dead of a forgotten era. But in the late 1960s, people started reporting something that had no business being in a cemetery. Something that moved. Something that watched from between the graves. Something tall, dark, and ice-cold that drained the life from animals, appeared in the dreams of people who lived nearby, and left witnesses so terrified they could barely speak. London had a vampire, and what followed was one of the strangest, most documented, and deeply bizarre supernatural investigations in modern history. A story involving rival occultists, a full-scale media circus, actual body desecrations, criminal trials, and a mystery that has never been fully resolved to this day. This is the story of the Highgate Vampire. It starts, as most strange things do, with people who simply could not explain what they were seeing. The first reported sightings came in the late 1960s from people walking along Swains Lane, the narrow road that runs alongside Highgate Cemetery's north entrance. They described a tall, gray figure hovering just inside the gates, not walking, not standing still, hovering. Several witnesses reported feeling an overwhelming wave of dread the moment they saw it. Not curiosity, not confusion, but pure primal terror that hit them before they could even process what they were looking at. One woman reported seeing a face staring at her through the cemetery railings late at night, pale, sunken-eyed, expressionless. She ran and did not stop running. A man walking his dog said his animal refused to pass the cemetery gates entirely, dropped to the ground, and would not move until they crossed to the other side of the road. Dead foxes began appearing near the cemetery walls, not killed by traffic, not killed by other animals. Drained. Their bodies empty of blood, with no visible wounds that could explain it. Then came the dreams. Multiple people living near Highgate reported the same recurring nightmare. A dark figure standing at the foot of their bed, watching them sleep, unable to move or speak as it leaned closer. They woke up exhausted. Some woke up with unexplained marks on their bodies. By early 1970, the sightings had built enough momentum that they could not be ignored. And that is when two men stepped forward and turned a local ghost story into a national obsession. Their names were Sean Manchester and David Farrant. Both were self-described occultists. Both claimed expertise in the paranormal. Both were absolutely certain that something supernatural was haunting Highgate Cemetery. And both of them hated each other with a passion that would define the next several decades of this story. Sean Manchester was the more theatrical of the two. He went to the local press and made a statement that no newspaper editor could resist. He said that Highgate Cemetery was home to a genuine undead vampire, one that had been brought to England in a coffin from Eastern Europe in the early 18th century by a nobleman practicing the black arts. Manchester claimed the vampire had been dormant for centuries inside a vault somewhere in the cemetery, and that recent construction work in the area had disturbed it, waking it from its long sleep. He proposed, publicly, in the newspaper, that a group of volunteers enter the cemetery at midnight, find the vampire's resting place, and drive a stake through its heart. The press went absolutely wild. The story ran in the Hampstead and Highgate Express in February 1970, and almost overnight Highgate Cemetery became the most talked about location in Britain. The BBC sent a television crew. Journalists flooded the area. And on the night of Friday, the 13th of March, 1970, hundreds of people showed up at the cemetery gates, some with crucifixes, some with wooden stakes, some simply with cameras, all hoping to witness or participate in an actual vampire hunt. The gates were stormed. People poured into the cemetery. Police arrived and eventually cleared the crowd, but not before several people claimed to have seen a dark figure moving between the graves in the chaos. It was extraordinary. It was reckless. And it was only the beginning. David Farrant, Manchester's rival, took a different approach. He was quieter, more methodical, and deeply committed to investigating the cemetery through what he called serious psychical research. He spent nights inside Highgate alone, documenting what he experienced, and he filed a letter to the local paper describing a tall, gray figure he had personally encountered near the North Gate. He stopped short of calling it a vampire. He called it a psychic entity, something darker and more complex than a simple undead creature from folklore. The rivalry between Manchester and Farrant became increasingly bitter. Each accused the other of being a fraud. Each claimed to be the only legitimate investigator of the Highgate case. They gave competing interviews. They wrote competing books. They publicly condemned one another for decades. And caught in the middle of their feud was a genuine mystery that neither of them ever fully resolved. Because things at Highgate were getting worse. In the early 1970s, the cemetery began showing signs of serious desecration. Graves were broken open. Coffins were disturbed. A body was found pulled from its resting place, decapitated, with a stake driven through its chest. Other tombs were vandalized with occult symbols. Animal remains were left at grave sites as offerings. The police were increasingly alarmed. This was no longer just a ghost story running in the local press. Real crimes were being committed in a real cemetery against real human remains. Investigations were opened. Arrests were made. David Farrant was eventually convicted of damaging memorials in a churchyard and interfering with a body, and served time in prison as a result. Sean Manchester always maintained that he was conducting legitimate vampire hunting operations under the belief that he was protecting the public from genuine supernatural danger. Whether you believe any of the supernatural claims or not, the desecrations were real. The criminal convictions were real. And the sense that something deeply wrong had taken root in and around Highgate Cemetery was shared by far too many people to be entirely dismissed. So what was the Highgate Vampire? What was actually happening? The explanations fall broadly into three camps. The first is that it was a genuine paranormal entity, a vampire, a demon, or some form of powerful psychic presence that had been awakened in the cemetery and was affecting the people and animals around it. This is the explanation that Manchester committed his entire public life to defending, and he continued writing and speaking about it well into his later years. The second explanation is more grounded, that the sightings were a combination of genuine misidentifications, urban legend building on itself, and mass suggestion. The cemetery was dark, overgrown, and genuinely atmospheric. Shadows moved strangely between the graves. People who went there already afraid of what they might see were primed to interpret anything unusual as something supernatural. The dead foxes likely had mundane explanations. The dreams could be attributed to anxiety and suggestion spreading through a community saturated with vampire stories. The third explanation sits somewhere in between, that there was something real being encountered, but not a vampire in the traditional sense. Some researchers have suggested a living person may have been using the cemetery at night, possibly for occult rituals, and that encounters with this individual became mythologized over time into something monstrous. The desecrations support this. A person did those things. Whether that person believed they were carrying out supernatural acts or was simply disturbed, The damage was done by human hands. What makes the Highgate case endure is that none of these explanations fully satisfies. The sheer number of independent sightings before the media coverage began is difficult to explain away entirely. The consistent descriptions, the tall, dark figure, the gray face, the feeling of dread, coming from people who had no contact with each other and no reason to fabricate the story, leave a thread that refuses to be neatly cut. Sean Manchester claimed he eventually found the vampire's tomb, performed a ritual exorcism, and laid the entity to rest. He wrote a book about it called The Highgate Vampire, published in 1985. David Farrant wrote his own account. The two men continued arguing about who told the truth for the rest of their lives. Highgate Cemetery still stands, still beautiful, still Gothic, still drawing visitors from all over the world who come to see the graves of Karl Marx, George Eliot, and dozens of other luminaries buried in its famous grounds. But some of them come for something else entirely. They come at dusk, and they stand at the north gate, and they look through the iron railings into the overgrown dark, just to see if anything looks back. So far, most of them walk away without an answer. Most of them. If this story got under your skin, hit subscribe, because we cover the legends, the investigations, and the unsolved mysteries that the history books leave out. Comment below and tell us which dark story you want us to go into next. Until then, keep the lights on.